We've all heard the same story before. Someone who is clinically dead with no heartbeat and no brain activity is brought back to life by medical staff. They then claim to have floated out of their body while they were clinically dead, seeing nurses and doctors working to resuscitate them. They can often provide details about what they saw from above and what the doctors and nurses in the room were saying. While individual stories vary, many recall seeing past loved ones or being greeted by angelic beings. They experience no pain and feel surrounded by love and compassion. They talk about going through some kind of tunnel and seeing a bright light. They almost always are given what has been called a life review, and then they are sent back for whatever reason and recount their experience to their sometimes concerned or skeptical friends and family. Between 60 and 80% of people in palliative care have near-death experiences, and upwards of 10% of people who undergo cardiac arrest claim to have floated above their body or that they went to another place. Well, guys, welcome back to Paranormal Community College. I'm your host, Riley, and today we're talking about what may be one of my favorite paranormal topics, and that is the near-death experience. I'd also like to dedicate this episode to Dr. Stafford Betty of California State University, who first introduced me to many of these stories I'm going to share with you today. Thank you for your passion and enthusiasm regarding the study of life after death, and thank you for being brave enough to deviate from the norm in the rigid world of academia. So, this episode is going to look extensively at end-of-life phenomenon experienced by hospice workers, but we're also going to look at children who experience NDEs and how their experiences differ, NDEs during childbirth, and some remarkable personal accounts from people around the world. We'll also see what the scientific community has to say, common themes, and what some prevailing theories are. But first, let's look at what our ancient ancestors had to say about this. So first, we have the story of the Pamphylion in Plato's Republic. Was a soldier who died in battle, but while on his funeral pyre, suddenly sprang to life and related his story of what he had experienced on the other side, what Plato calls the world beyond. Describes being bathed in light, and that this light was coming from an intelligent source, that it was alive in some way. He claimed everything got brighter and more radiant as he passed through this light tunnel. He says a bright blue sky, spiritual beings, as well as other human souls. He sees that there are holes in the sky and that people who are good get to go to heaven and bad people have to go to hell. And by bad people, we're talking about tyrants and murderers and every politician who has ever walked the earth. He saw souls crying as they were being forced to drink from the river Lethe to forget about the past life they had on earth. He saw others overwhelmed with joy. Was told about how it all works, that these people were judged upon how they lived their life, and that some people felt very unhappy about how they lived their life. He was told that souls are given 7 days to enjoy this aspect of the afterlife before they must journey on. Was not allowed to have a life review or to drink from the river Lethe, because he was meant to deliver this message of all he had seen back to his friends and family on earth. In Plutarch's The Divine Vengeance, a man has fallen from a great height and is unconscious for 3 days. When he awakes, he claims that after he fell, his intelligence was driven from his body. He saw himself and he saw a relative who had died when he was very young. He claimed he could see everything in 360 degrees all at once. Like he was given a tour of the afterlife. He sees the river Lethe where people drink to forget their previous life on earth. He claims they get drunk and ecstatic on this, but also mentions the sadness some people displayed about going back to earth or moving on to the next phase of existence. He claimed that nothing he saw was very familiar and everything was bathed in a kind of rainbow light. After this experience, he becomes a better person, thinking about the sad souls in the afterlife and the happy ones and which one he wanted to be. Timarchus of Chaeronea, a student of Socrates, claims to have induced within himself a near-death experience through fasting and meditation. For 3 days, he meditated in a cave until he felt a crack in the back of his skull. Not painful, but more like an opening. He felt his soul move out of his body and could hear beautiful music as he looked down at himself. Timarchus, unfortunately, in a short-lived near-death experience or meditation-induced hallucination, looks down to see the bad place, to see people sobbing and wailing in pain. Now, it's not lost on me that the ancient Greeks especially loved to tell stories to convey different philosophies or life lessons. Maybe these stories were all made up, a philosopher or historian's way of illustrating an idea or message of some kind. However, The existence of life after death and the process of reincarnation even was believed by famous Greek philosophers such as Plato. And we'll get into more of that in the reincarnation episode coming up in a few weeks. The oldest medical documentation of an NDE was recorded in the 18th century by French physician Pierre-Jean de Monchaux in Anecdotes de Médecine. In this book, he expresses that patients have experienced this phenomenon. Being an enlightened man of the 1700s, de Monchaux speculates that this may be caused by too much blood flow in the brain upon death, producing mystical feelings or visions. While he doesn't give great detail about the nature of the experience, the patient in question, a highly respected pharmacist, claimed to have been met with a beautiful warm light and that he thought he had gone to heaven. In the 1980s, psychiatrist Bruce Grayson created a set of criteria to measure the near-death experience phenomenon. Scoring 7 or higher in a 16-question questionnaire may qualify you as someone who has experienced something transcendental during a near-death experience. Patient stories of near-death phenomenon are frequently reported by hospice nurses. While patients are quite literally on their deathbeds, they tell their nurses that they are seeing dead loved ones or catching a glimpse into another world. They may claim to see angels or may ask, "Who's that?" when there's no one else in the room. Julie McFadden, an experienced hospice nurse, describes it in a nutshell. Quote, "It usually happens a month or so before the patient dies. They start seeing dead relatives, dead friends, old pets that have passed on, spirits and angels that are visiting them and only they can see them. Sometimes it's through a dream. Sometimes they physically see them, and they'll actually ask us, 'Do you see what I'm seeing?'" End quote. McFadden added that it comforts dying patients, bringing them a certain sense of calm. She says they're usually not afraid. It's usually very comforting to them, and they usually say they're sending a message like, "We're coming to get you soon," or "Don't worry, we'll help you." Most people love this. They're very comforted by it. It's not scary to them, she said. Now, I know what you might be thinking. These people are usually very elderly, they're on a bunch of drugs, so of course they're seeing things. Or maybe this is just what our brains do when they know we are going to die and they know we are scared. But let's get into some specific cases because there are several common themes and some exceptional stories here. I'd like to share with you some excerpts from the book Final Gifts, Understanding the Special Awareness, Needs, and Communications of the Dying by hospice nurses Maggie Clananan and Patricia Kelly. I read this book in college in Dr. Stafford Betty's class, and it truly made such an impression on me. And if you happen to know anyone in hospice, I highly recommend this book. You don't have to believe in the afterlife whatsoever, but this book is just a really great resource in understanding the dying process and how to support dying loved ones when they talk about seeing other worlds or seeing people in the room with them. So the authors actually refer to this as nearing death awareness as opposed to a near-death experience. While they may see similar things and describe similar feelings, with nearing death awareness, it is much more gradual or comes and goes. The authors say, quote, "When dying people begin to have these experiences, they often seem preoccupied, distracted, perhaps even a little puzzled. They may ask questions, seem glassy-eyed, or appear to be looking through us as if focused on something beyond. Dying people are not bothered by these experiences, but find them generally pleasant, reassuring, and even comforting." End quote. They go on to say that it is friends and family members who feel bothered upon hearing these things. They worry their loved one is hallucinating or maybe confused or becoming demented. This book is meant to show people how they can react to these situations in a way that is supportive and so helpful to their loved one. Because when the dying loved ones don't understand or think they're being crazy, that can be very disheartening and distressing for them. So the first story I'd like to talk to you about is that of a 17-year-old girl named Ellen. This blonde-haired, blue-eyed cheerleader with a bright personality unfortunately succumbed rapidly to aggressive bone cancer. When she was close to dying, she kept telling her parents that she needed a map, that she was lost. She was frantic and her frail body was writhing about in her bed as she tried to explain to her parents that she needed the map. "Where's the map?" she cried. "If I could find the map, I could go home. I want to go home." Her parents tried to explain to her that she was already at home, but Ellen insisted that she needed to get back home. With the help of the hospice nurse, the parents understood that she may be referring to heaven, that perhaps she had already seen a glimpse of it and that that was what she was trying to explain and that it was completely normal. After they told her that they understood her and that she would find the map and she would get to go back home, she quickly calmed down and went to sleep. The next day, she died in her sleep, her mom saying that she had found her way home. This is a common theme. Patients become distraught or very preoccupied with being prepared to go somewhere. They also often use language that we associate with travel, such as they are waiting for a bus or for a boat, or they are waiting in line to get to go somewhere. One patient mentioned in Final Gifts is George, who insists that he needs his passports and all of his documents must be in order because people in his room told him that he had to go with him soon. He died 10 days later. Seeing people in the room that others can't see is also a common occurrence in nearing death awareness. One patient, Fred, would interrupt conversation to tell the people he was seeing to go away and that he wasn't ready yet. He didn't seem scared, just annoyed. An atheist woman by the name of Angela claimed she saw an angel sitting on her bed one morning and that she felt so much love and warmth and compassion from this being. She said she didn't know about angels or spirits or anything like that, and that wasn't really important, because she felt such a sense of calmness and said that she knew that when she died, that being would be there with her and that she wouldn't die alone. Now, this next story is one of the most incredible for me, and it's the one I most remembered since college, and it is that of a woman named Sue. So here is an excerpt from her story in Final Gifts. A dignified Chinese woman, Sue was getting devoted care from her daughter Lily. Both were Buddhist and very accepting of the mother's terminal status. "I've had a good life for 93 years, she said, and I've been on this earth long enough." She dreamed often of her husband, who had died some years before. "I will join him soon," she said, but one day Sue seemed very puzzled. "Why is my sister with my husband?" she asked. "They are both calling me to come." "Is your sister dead?" I asked. "No, she still lives in China," she said. "I have not seen her for very many years." When I related the conversation to the daughter, she was astonished and tearful. "My aunt died 2 days ago in China," Lily said. "We decided not to tell Mother. Her sister had the same kind of cancer. It was a very painful death. She lived in a remote village where good medical care wasn't available. We didn't want to upset or frighten Mother since she is so sick herself." Lily eventually told her mother the truth, and Sue said, with a knowing smile, "Now I understand." Her puzzle solved, she died 3 weeks later at peace and with a sense of anticipation. The companionship and support these presences provide for a person about to die is evident. I always thought that was such an incredible story because it makes sense that maybe our minds would think of angelic beings or dead loved ones when we're dying to kind of help us through the dying process. But in this case, Sue saw her deceased sister before ever knowing she had passed. And with that, I'd like to share with you a personal story. So my cousin, when he was maybe 4 or 5, claimed that he saw my grandma with the angels after she had died, and that she was going to be all right, and was even annoyed by everyone being so upset because according to him, she looked so happy. The strange thing is, no one had told him yet that grandma wasn't going to be around anymore. And they were besties, by the way, so I think everyone was a little bit nervous of how my cousin would react. And so when his mom told him, this was his response. He already knew, and he had already seen her with the angels, and he knew that she was fine. There's so many remarkable and heartwarming stories in this book. So again, those were excerpts from Final Gifts, Understanding the Special Awareness, Needs, and Communications of the Dying by Maggie Clananan and Patricia Kelly. But let's get into some other stories from hospice nurses that I found interesting. This story is coming from Patty Smith, age 59 and hospice nurse for 17 years. She said, "I didn't believe in the afterlife before I became a hospice nurse, but I do now." She recalled an instance where an elderly man said he had seen his wife in the corner of the ceiling that day. His wife had told him that he'll be joining her soon, not today, but tomorrow. Sure enough, he ended up dying the next day. Some patients seem to know the exact day they will die, or will say something like, "It will be within the week," or "by the weekend." Patty Smith adds that these kind of experiences can often happen when the patient seems to be in a very clear and lucid state. They often start within a month or so before the patient dies and become more intense as the day gets closer. Going back to hospice nurse Julie McFadden, she says one of her elderly patients who was dying of lung cancer claimed to see his son John sitting in the chair next to him. His son had died in Vietnam several years prior. The patient said, "He looks wonderful in his uniform. He says, 'It's time for me to go.' He died just a few days later." Another hospice nurse by the name of Dawn said one of her patients said she saw a bunch of people she didn't know waiting around her bed, just kind of calmly waiting for her. She ended up dying within the hour. What's interesting about that, and what is a common occurrence in NDEs, i.e., seeing people you don't know, is that some people say these strangers are members of our soul family or spirit family. We may not recognize these people on Earth, but people who believe in this soul family claim that we will know and remember these people once we cross over. They are sent to kind of welcome you back and support you while you're transitioning from death to the other side. Sometimes they are described as angels in pure white robes. Other hospice nurses say their patients often mention a train or a bus and that they are waiting for some kind of train or bus to pick them up, but why can't they get on yet? Or they see a past loved one on a bus or a train of some kind who say, "I'll come pick you up soon." One woman apparently saw her husband, who had died a few years earlier, and he told her he would pick her up the next day to go for a picnic. She then had to have her makeup done and picked out a certain dress she needed to wear for her hot date with her husband. She died the next day in her pretty dress, with her pretty makeup and a smile on her face. To quote one last hospice nurse before we move on, she says, "Hospice isn't just about death and dying. It's about learning what's really important in life and keeping those memories alive." Many, of course not all, but many patients have time to reflect, to think about their lives. They miss their past loved ones and hope to see them, and maybe they do see them. But let's get into the cases where people die and come back to life with stories about another place, the classic near-death experience. A woman by the name of Pam Reynolds was having a complicated and very risky brain surgery. She only had a 50% chance of surviving the procedure because the aneurysm was so close to the brainstem. They had to lower her body temperature greatly, tape her eyes shut, place headphones over her ears that made loud clicking noises that would read her brain activity. Her breathing and heartbeat needed to be stopped to perform the surgery. Pam claims during the surgery she floated above her body and was able to see the operating room. She felt, quote, more aware than normal. She reported seeing the surgical saw, but said it looked like an electric toothbrush, and that was indeed true. She said she could hear conversations between operating room staff, even though she had earphones on which were making loud clicking noises in order to monitor her brain function. At some point during the operation, she said she noticed a presence and was being pulled towards a light. She says she began to discern figures in the light, including her grandmother, an uncle, other deceased relatives, and people unknown to her. According to Reynolds, the longer she was there, the more she enjoyed it. But at some point, she was reminded that she had to go back. She says her uncle brought her back to her body, but she did not want to go. So he pushed her in, accompanied by a sensation like that of jumping into ice water, she says. A woman named Cynthia went into cardiac arrest when a hospital employee gave her medication containing aspirin, something she is deathly allergic to. She describes floating out of her body and watching the doctors try to resuscitate her. She felt no anxiety or concern, just a little curiosity. She then describes what happened to her next in her own words. She says, "From there, I went to a place where I was surrounded by white light. I felt a peace and harmony like I've never felt here on earth. In no way did I feel judged or anything like that. It just felt like I was in the arms of God and I felt safe. Then I saw a review of my life, both the good and the bad. After the review, I felt strongly drawn to return to physical life because I realized from the life review that there were things I had not completed. I also could have stayed where I was. It was so wonderful. But I think that my desire to handle unfinished business on earth was powerful, so I was given a choice to either stay or return to my body. I chose to return to my body. From that dimension of light in which I experienced only peace, love, and comfort, I returned to an enormous amount of pain. I was intubated and couldn't breathe on my own. It is difficult to explain the hardship of being unable to draw your own breaths because a machine is doing it for you. The desire to breathe is instinctual. It was horrible. I was later told by the doctor who had prescribed the aspirin-based pain medication that since they didn't know exactly how long I had been deprived of oxygen, they were concerned about the amount of brain damage I may have suffered. Thankfully, I came out of that whole experience with few long-term health consequences. Now I look back on the whole thing as a gift. It certainly didn't feel that way at the time. It was a real struggle for a while. I knew I had many changes to make in my life, but after the NDE, the spiritual aspects of life became much more important to me. Even so, there were times in the beginning where I wished I had not come back. Certain people in my life were taking advantage of me, and in another way, I wasn't living the life I now knew I needed to live. Some of the changes ahead of me were hard but necessary. As I look back on it, it was such a blessing. I did make the changes that I came back for, finish unfinished business. I live a life in a different way, and a big part of it is that I know there is nothing to fear. When we pass on to the next dimension, we are just dropping the body. From the standpoint of our consciousness, nothing changes. We are still ourselves. Okay, this next story is kind of hilarious. I don't know if the author made this whole thing up or if it really happened or it was just a weird dream, but either way, it's probably my favorite NDE story. She says, "In the ambulance, my heart stopped beating for 3 minutes, and during that time, I find myself walking through a beautiful garden with a sparkling brook running through it. On the other side of a bridge stood Jesus and all his apostles, smiling beatifically. Jesus said something to me which I assumed was an invitation to cross the bridge, but when I set foot on it, he said, 'No, can't you read?' It was then that I looked down and saw a sign on the bridge that read, 'Apostles Only.' Jesus pointed downstream where a log lay across the brook. I nodded, walked to the log, and tried to cross. But the log was deceptively slippery. Each time I got about halfway across, I fell into the brook, and each time, Jesus and the apostles laughed at me. It wasn't a malicious laughter, really, just an expression of delight. But still, I couldn't help taking it personally when I came back to life in the ER. I felt hurt and confused." This sounds like some weird dream I would have, and the apostles only part kind of kills me, but who knows, maybe it wasn't her time, and that's why she kept slipping as she tried to cross the stream. One woman who was having a severe seizure during a procedure claimed, "I opened my eyes and saw my deceased great-grandmother and 2 of my aunts. I felt peace, love, absence of physical pain, and at that point, I simply burst out of my body. It was extraordinary. Imagine all the love that all the mothers in the world have for their children combined and put that into one person. Then imagine that it is not even close to 1% of what I felt. It was a boundless explosion of love. I heard and felt what the doctor was thinking. When they found the source of the bleeding, I moved to another world. I stood in front of 3 old men with white beards, and one of them said I shouldn't be there. She then returned to a body." The science of near-death experiences is sometimes approached with great skepticism, like in the case of Eben Alexander, a senior U.S. neurosurgeon and Harvard lecturer. But that all changed in 2008 when he himself went through such an experience during a medically induced coma when being treated for a rare and severe form of meningitis. He described, among other things, the feeling of floating over streams, waterfalls, and being in different fields, as well as seeing people who danced, millions of butterflies and children smiling and laughing. He writes, "After being placed on a ventilator, a light came slowly down from above, throwing off marvelous filaments of living silver and golden effulgence. It was a circular entity emitting heavenly music that I called the spinning melody. The light opened up like a rip, and I felt myself going through the rip up into a valley full of lush and fertile greenery, where waterfalls flowed into crystal pools. There were clouds like marshmallow puffs of pink and white. Behind them, the sky was a rich blue-black with trees, fields, animals, and people. There was water, too, flowing in rivers or descending as rain. Mist rose from the pulsing surfaces of these waters, and fish glided beneath them. In fact, he says, the world we live in, this material world, is more kind of cloudy and dreamlike than what I saw on the other side. That world is sharp, crisp, and alive, and very real." He also said he saw other people there, including women with blue eyes who didn't communicate with him physically, but telepathically. And they said, "You are loved, you are cherished, there is nothing you can do wrong." Now, I'm not gonna lie, his story is a little too detailed, and he has made probably a bunch of money from a few books like this, so I'm kind of skeptical of his story, but it's one of the most well-known ones, so there you have it. So now we're gonna switch gears a little bit. I had never heard of this until I started researching for this episode, but some women claim to have near-death experiences while giving birth. A study conducted in Sweden in the 70s through the 90s titled Near-Death Experiences and Other Transpersonal Experiences Among Women During Childbirth explained these strange occurrences. Here's what one woman in Stockholm had to say. When giving birth to my son, I had a very long labor for 2 days. The baby was too big. Suddenly, there was tremendous pressure and pain, and I was like slipping out through the top of my head. I just remember sort of floating up in the right-hand corner of the room, and that there was a very bright light. I was there, but not in my body. I was up near the ceiling looking down. My vision was very sharp, although I normally wear glasses. I could hear people in my thoughts, almost intuitively. I was looking down at myself, observing 2 persons in hospital gowns working on me on the stretcher. It was all in normal colors. Then I noticed that there was a doctor coming in. Why did he come? Wasn't my child well? I was extremely calm. I wasn't scared at all, but a little confused by everything going on below me. The doctor used forceps to bring my little boy out. I watched everything from above and saw that the doctor was bald-headed and the red face of my baby boy looked like an old man. When I finally woke up on the ward later, I wanted to see my son. The nurse finally came in and she asked me how I knew that I had had a boy. And when I said that I had seen him when she was cleaning him off after his birth, she gave me a strange look and just walked out. In another instance, a woman was not given enough anesthesia during an emergency C-section, and the intense pain, she said, forced her out of her body through the top of her head, where she then watched the procedure and saw them pull a baby boy out of her. When she looked up to the ceiling, she saw her grandmother who died 10 years earlier. Her grandma told her that she had to go back to be with her son. When this new mother re-entered her body and woke up, she asked to see her son. Now, it's my understanding that ultrasound technology was just recently beginning to be able to determine the sex of a child in the womb during the 70s, and so that type of technology might not have been available there or may not have been widely used yet. Based on a quick search, I think it was also much more expensive than it is today, because the nurse goes, "How did you know it was a boy?" The mother said that she saw everything and even heard them joking around and saw that nurse accidentally scratch her baby boy on the forehead with a surgical instrument. She said, "Why would you do that?" Another patient described in detail what she experienced on the other side. She said, "This light was a spiritual experience, giving knowledge about life, educating me that the deeds we do in our lives on earth are of great value. Every little detail is of big importance, as a smile at anyone or if you save a young bird. I was shown in detail things I had done wrong in my life, but the information was given to me with great love and understanding. Understanding was the strongest word. The wisdom was given to me by the light, and I know that to die is to exist in this fantastic light, and I am not afraid to die one day. But all the time I knew that I had to go back. I got much energy and power from the light. It helped me. I was telepathically told to return. I did, and saw the midwives and the doctors from above and heard a female doctor saying, 'Make her ready for operation.' I returned through the top of my head and, so to speak, slipped down into my body. I brought lots of light and energy, and it helped me to bear my little son without cesarean." Some women report meeting the soul of their soon-to-be child before birth or having some kind of transcendental and transpersonal spiritual connection before giving birth. Here's one of those experiences. This woman says, "As I lay half-conscious, I saw a mental picture and a human soul surrounded with intelligent beings, deciding where on earth the soul should descend. Next, I rushed through a dark tunnel and out in the universe. Suddenly, I saw our planet. I realized that this soul would come to planet Earth. I joined the soul and saw the continents and the country, the town and the hospital where I was, and I realized that this soul would be in my child, and I would be her mother. And then I came to and bore my daughter." Now, I know the stories we've covered so far have seemed super out there. I know these stories are super difficult for people to believe, and truly none of us can know what's on the other side until it happens to us. But I think we should keep an open mind because there are so many similarities and common themes. And I mean, maybe it's just our consciousness coming up with the same ideas, but I don't know. I think there might be something to these stories. This study in Sweden ultimately concluded that within the 100 patients they studied who claimed to have a near-death experience, as much as 34% have had that experience during childbirth. Speaking of children, So far, we've talked about adults with near-death experiences, but what do children have to say about all this? According to the International Association for Near-Death Studies, as many as 85% of children who undergo cardiac arrest have a near-death experience. Children such as Ingrid Hunkala, who grew up in the mountains of Colombia. The country was war-torn in the early 1970s. Her young working parents struggled to get by. Ingrid was small and sickly. One morning, as she and her older sister were playing catch over a large water tank, Ingrid reached for the ball and plunged headfirst into the tank. The water inside was freezing cold from the morning air, and she sank to the bottom. She struggled but soon found herself surrounded by flowers of breathtaking beauty that went on forever. They seemed to lift her upward. Her aching, sickly body was freed of pain. From her vantage point above, she could see the maid in charge blissfully listening to the radio inside the house. She could see her mother walking to work. I went from a place of absolute horror to absolute joy, Ingrid says. However, when Ingrid was brought back, much to her family's relief and joy, Ingrid struggled feeling connected to her family. She told them to stop calling her Ingrid and that she didn't need a name. She kept saying she wanted to go back to where she went when she died. Of course, Ingrid eventually got over this, but that's also a common theme in some of these NDEs. People claim that they didn't want to come back and that they feel kind of a sense of depression when they get back here. For 3-year-old Teresa McLean, there was no soothing presence or light. She left her body inside a German hospital. Her frantic mother had taken her there after Teresa had accidentally eaten 2 bottles of chewable baby aspirin. In her NDE, Teresa saw 2 scenes before her, as if on a split screen. On one, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to revive her. On the other, her mom sat in the waiting room sobbing. Teresa felt her mother's emotions, her pain and fear, as if they were her own. It was terrifying. Then the scene changed. She saw her mother many years into the future. It wasn't a vision or a dream. No, these images were more real than real to Teresa. In the future, her parents had divorced. Her mother was overcome with grief, struggling to survive without her daughter. Teresa knew she had to come back. She couldn't leave her mother, and the next instant she returned to her body. This one is interesting because only in very few cases do people claim to see possible futures or what the future would look like if they were no longer in it. A 4-year-old who was hospitalized for an illness that caused him to go into cardiac arrest kept asking his mom afterwards if they could go to the park. She'd take him to this park and that park, but he insisted he was looking for a very particular park. When asked which park, he said, "The one through the tunnel that I went to when I was in the hospital. There was a park with lots of children and swings and things with a white fence around it. I tried to climb over the fence, but this man stopped me and said that I wasn't to come yet, and he sent me back down the tunnel and I was back in the hospital again." This next story is what happened to Natasha, now age 33, from Cardiff, Wales, who is deaf, by the way. At the age of 9, she'd had such a severe bout of whooping cough that the doctor had told her parents she was unlikely to survive the night. She was at home and fast asleep when she was woken by a bright light. She says, "The light was spilling into the room around the edge of the door and I could hear my name being called, even though I'm profoundly deaf. I got up to see what the light was and turned around to see myself still in bed asleep. But the voice kept calling me, so I opened the bedroom door and it was just this pure, brilliant white light. I stepped into it and kept walking towards the voice. I was just walking in light, there wasn't anything else. Then I was in a room and realized there was a presence behind me. He put a hand on my shoulder but told me not to turn around. I had to go back," he said, "because I was important and I had a job to do." The next day, the crisis in Natasha's illness had passed, but she didn't tell anyone about her experience for many years. "I thought they'd think I was crazy or lying," she said. Now, some people unfortunately don't have a great near-death experience. The hellish near-death experiences are far less common, but some people do experience them. They describe a sensation of falling into darkness. They see a tunnel too, but there's no light at the end of it. No sense of overwhelming love and compassion. If this kind of topic makes you feel uncomfortable, feel free to skip ahead. But here are some personal accounts. One man relates, "I went downstairs. Downstairs was dark, people were howling, there was fire. They wanted a drink of water. It was not a tunnel, more than a tunnel, a great big one. I was floating down. I saw a lot of people down there screaming, howling, no clothes on. I'd say almost about 1 million people. They were miserable and hateful. Now, personally, I hope with these stories, these people had just taken some bad drugs and are on a bad trip. But, I mean, if we're going to talk about the heavenly experiences, I figured I got to put in some of the bad ones too. Another person said, I began to hear screaming, shrieks, heart-rending, horrible, horrible laughter, and the most revolting stench you can imagine. And then the black environment changed into fire, and there were all kinds of terrible-looking and frightening creatures. A patient named D claimed, the next thing I knew there was something behind me, and I was afraid. I felt this awful presence, and I knew that it was after me. This thing, this awful, this terrifying thing, I could feel it on me. I was being chased by something that was the personification of evil, and it wanted me. It wanted to destroy me. I was terrified, and I was crying, and I remember thinking, oh God, help me, God. In another story, a 9-year-old boy had a negative near-death experience. He fell from a cliff and remembers hearing growling noises and sensing an evil presence behind him. He also felt like he was going down a tunnel. It turns out this kid had accidentally killed his friend when he was 6 years old. He hid the body, and it was never discovered that Mike was responsible. Perhaps these hellish experiences derive from a deep sense of guilt. Maybe people experience them as a sort of warning to get their shit together and be a better person. Maybe it is the guilt in our subconscious creating our own personal kind of hell that we've unfortunately chosen for ourselves. What's interesting about the bad NDEs is that experiencers also claim to receive a life review, but in their life review, they feel a deep sense of regret and despair. They are able to see how much they have hurt people. They are able to feel how their actions affect others negatively and experience a sense of deep moral failure. They encounter other bitter, miserable souls. My grandpa claimed to have possibly had a NDE when he had a stroke and was in a coma for a while. During his coma, he said he was in some sort of dark dungeon and desperately crying out for help. He was also crying out for water. He said he then saw a demon. I asked him what exactly the demon looked like, but post-stroke, he wasn't really good at giving details. But he said he saw this demon and that the demon started laughing at him until the demon said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here." But after that experience, which very well may have been just a coma nightmare because those do exist. I was gonna include coma nightmares in this, but I just didn't have time. My grandpa became much more loving and just a softer individual. Not like he wasn't already, especially with his grandkids. He was just more so. He just looked lighter after that, even though it was a negative experience. At least, he was told he wasn't supposed to be there, I guess. But I'll leave you with one hilarious hell story to kind of lighten things up a bit here. So Pastor Gerald Johnson, 49 of Texas, said Rihanna's hit song Umbrella echoed through the gates of hell during his bizarre visit to purgatory. Mr. Johnson said, "It just blew me away. It still baffles me to this day. There was a section in hell where music was playing. It was the same music we hear here on earth, but opposed to entertainers singing it, demons were singing it. While up here, you can listen to music to get over a breakup like Don't Worry, Be Happy or Umbrella, but down there, every lyric to every song is to torment you." When I hear NDE stories like this that are just kind of like bizarre and sound more like a weird dream, it kind of makes me wonder if these are just, I don't know, dreamlike states that people who are dying or are going through the dying process kind of experience. I'm not sure. Because of that Apostles Only story, some of them they just seem almost comical. So, what do we think? What do scientists and psychologists think? In the medical field, there are those who believe these stories have some truth in them, or they at least believe that their patients are experiencing something and not just losing their minds. Others, who are far more skeptical, blame it on the release of DMT in the brain when we die, or simply say that perhaps this is how our brains confront the dying process. They say there is no afterlife or real near-death communication with loved ones, but ultimately, none of us will know what happens until we pass away. But hopefully that's a really long time from now. But before we end, let's summarize the common themes that seem to be present in almost every NDE story. So number one, we got the feeling of ultra reality. The knowing that what they are seeing and experiencing after death is more real than life on Earth. They often say their life on Earth feels like a dream. Number two, seeing loved ones, including grandparents, parents, siblings, even a pet dog or cat. They are there to greet you, and sometimes they are there to tell you that you have to go back. Number three, many experience hearing a whirring or buzzing noise. Many also report hearing beautiful music. Number four, we have the tunnel, of course, and being surrounded by a warm light. Number five, seeing people you don't know or seeing angels or otherwise spiritual beings. Number six, the life review, where most say is less about judgment and more about learning and knowing how your actions on earth affected others. How did you make other people feel? Were you someone who hurt people all the time, or more often did you make them laugh and smile and feel important? Number seven, beautiful landscapes, mountains, green pastures, glittering streams, fields of flowers. But you just can't go into the apostles only section, or apparently Jesus and the apostles will laugh at you. Number eight, they also are able to accurately recall what was happening when they were out of their body. They hear what the doctors say, they know where their family members were and what they were doing. They can describe surgical instruments accurately. There's one case, a woman told her surgeon that she saw his pen roll over to the window. She said that's where her body was, and she watched the doctors try to resuscitate her. She said his pen rolled over to her feet, he picked it up, and then ran back over. He was shocked to hear this because she was obviously unconscious at the time, but more than that, she was blind. I know the belief in life after death is difficult for many, and I know for many, life after death and the idea of a final judgment can inspire fear and anxiety. However, for me, given what I personally think about the human soul and the nature of God and the universe, this all makes a lot of sense, and I find these stories very comforting. Take the info I've given you as you will. Perhaps it is just our brain's way of dealing with the death process, just the pineal gland and DMT producing what we need to accept our death. But for me, I think the act of dying here on Earth is followed by something like a homecoming. And maybe it is chemically induced and not so much magical, or maybe it's a bit of both, but maybe that's not ultimately what's important. We saw how comforting these moments can be to those who are dying and how these powerful experiences encouraged other people to change their lives, and I think that's pretty cool. That concludes this episode. Thank you all so much for listening, and if you or someone you know has had an NDE, please DM me on Instagram or TikTok, or email me at paranormalcommunitycollege@gmail.com. Next time, we'll be talking about the 1973 Pascagoula alien abduction case. So until then, I hope you have a beautiful weekend. Thank you.